Our next speaker is Jennifer Pitt, who is a senior resource analyst with Environmental Defense, who will talk about the river no more, water for the Delta.
Well, thank you all for having me here, and I think I should explain that a senior resource analyst means that I'm not an attorney, and I'm not a scientist, and I'm not an economist, but I dabble in all three. And I think that what you may find, you'll see how well that works. Sometimes I think of myself as sort of Jenny of all trades, master of none. So let's see how it goes. This is the section where we're talking about the unmet needs on the Colorado River. So I'm going to talk about water for the Delta. And mostly when we talk about the Colorado River, everyone has in their minds a vision of the Colorado and its headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park. That's the top photo on the right there. And everybody knows about the Colorado River, or something about the Colorado River, as it makes its way through the Grand Canyon. And then people get this sort of fuzzy idea about the Colorado River in its delta. Is there water there? Does it dry out? And Carl has done actually an excellent job of trying to define some of those resources and values that are in the delta today. So I'm not going to cover that, but rather talk more about the water that makes its way there, which in the pre-Dambrian, as Carl showed you, it had massive landform shaping force. So it was a powerful river once, and is a little different today. So I'm going to talk about what are the flows that in fact sustain what is there today, and then explore a little bit about whether or not I think those flows are going to last, given that we've heard that they are not protected. And then, since I don't think they're going to last, if we don't do something about it, okay, so let's buy the water. And then maybe touch a little bit in my non-attorney way on the central question of this conference, what about the law of the river? And then a little bit in my non-economist way, how much will it cost? So just again to square you on the geography, the delta is at the very bottom of the Colorado River system, at the top of the upper Gulf. And what I want to point out to you here is a little subtlety that people sometimes overlook, which is that the delta, or at least what most of the conservation community defines as the delta, starts right up here at Morello Dam. It's just south of what we call the northerly international boundary. And there are 23 miles here, where to the right you have Arizona, to the east you have Arizona, and to the west you have the state of Baja California, which means that there is a considerable reach of the Colorado River that exists in the United States. And that's going to be important to remember as we move our way through this. Just to touch on, again, those values of the Colorado River Delta, Carl did a great job with them earlier. I also worked on a big project with my colleague Francisco Zamora, who you're going to hear from after me, on a publication called Conservation Priorities in the Colorado River Delta, which is based on a sort of consensus of many experts who helped us define really what are all of those environmental assets in the Delta in the United States and Mexico. The Colorado has a reputation as a river no more, and that came from Philip Fradkin's 1981 book of that title, where he noted that the river really had become a grand ditch. And I just wanted to point out some of the structures. This is getting a little repetitive today, but some of the structures up and down the river that have controlled it, and those include, starting at the top left and then going clockwise around, Morro Point, Crystal, the Glen Canyon Dam, Hoover Dam, the Central Arizona Project, Imperial, that's not Imperial, that is Imperial. And finally the AllAmerican Canal, the inlet works. What those have done essentially is eliminate the nature from the river, although they have also made it possible to tame the Colorado's violent spring floods, to protect water users who need those reliable year-round supplies, and to bring large cities to deserts where they really otherwise would never have existed. But as I said, in doing so, they're also eliminating nature from the river, and because without its roaring floods, as we heard from Jack earlier, without those roaring floods and the more modest base flows, and critically, without a real sustaining flow through the delta, without a regular flow through the delta into the upper Gulf, the Colorado simply can't sustain the flora and fauna that evolved along with it. Today, there are 22 endangered species listed by the United States on the lower river and five more species of special concern. So between Hoover and Morello Dam, Colorado River flows are what we call attenuated. They're managed by these projects. And what I'm going to show you here on this graph is the flow in, I believe it's 1906. That's the darker line here, where you can see there was that big spring pulse flood, and then it trailed off in the drier, or in the seasons of the year when the snow melt had run off. Where the spring flood exceeded 70,000 cubic feet per second. And then compare that to the pink line, which is the 2004 flood, the 2004 flow, which you can see that the flow never got above 20,000 cubic feet per second. And that's just an indication of how considerably the flows on the Colorado have been changed. And Jack talked about how that limits the ecological function, that the river no longer reaches its floodplain in that reach of the river, essentially from Hoover down to Morello Dam. So to get to the delta emerged as an area of great environmental interest because flows in the delta aren't exactly the same as what I just showed you in the reach of the river, where those massive deliveries are being made to water users. There are some characteristics that make it work a little bit more like a river is supposed to. It has low base flows and relatively high flood flows, at least relative to those low base flows, while the river upstream has extremely high base flows and very little flood flow in comparison to that high base flow. So as a result, the delta below Morello Dam really does have some of the best remaining native habitat on the lower Colorado River. The extent and density of native trees in this reach is considerably greater than what you find upstream, where on the lower Colorado, really the only substantial native habitat remaining is at the confluence of the Bill Williams. A recent study done by someone who just finished his PhD at the University of Arizona found bird densities to be 10 times higher on the Colorado River in the delta than they are upstream from Morello Dam. That's a pretty significant difference. So I want to talk a little bit about how the Colorado River flows to the delta, and to impress upon you a couple of points. Number one, as we've heard already today, the flows that reach the delta are inadvertent. They're essentially the slop in the system that's whatever isn't being stored and can't be used upstream. There's no legal mechanism to draw the water down through this reach of the river. Number two, these flows, despite the fact that they are inadvertent, have actually been quite substantial at times. Now, this is the record of flows past Morello Dam for the 20th century. Essentially, you can see before Hoover was developed that most of the river ended up down there. You can see the dip when Lake Mead was filling. You can see that flows recovered somewhat after that, and then you can see this very dry period when the Glen Canyon Dam had been built and Lake Powell was filling behind it. And then, in a sort of happy circumstance or serendipity of events, down here in the 80s, you see a very wet period in the system, followed by at the same time that the reservoir had filled, our reservoir system was full, so there was a lot of excess in the system. And those floods reached the delta and actually created or revived quite a bit of habitat down there. And it's actually one of the things that's really interesting about working on this area as a restoration project is that it's not scientifically or technically very challenging. It's really a question of just add water and the native habitat comes back. What's really challenging is the institutional arrangements that you have to try to work out to get the water there. I want to show you another chart of flows that have reached the delta. Again, these are actually the flows that are passing Morello Dam, so it's not actually a measure of all water that's in the channel, but this looks at the period of 2000 to 2004. This is a chart that was produced by Reclamation, and the axis here is mean daily flows, so it's expressed in cubic feet per second, not acre feet. And across here we have 4 years, so it's on a much finer scale than the last graph I showed you. And you can see that a lot of the time there's not much going on. There's no water flowing past Morello Dam. But you can actually see that there is a substantial amount of activity, that there are times, in fact, when these non-storable flows have been so great as to actually cause overbank flooding events. Now, think about this, 2000 to 2004. Now, what have we already heard about the river during this time period? This is a time period of a sort of unprecedented, at least in the historical record, unprecedented drought on the river. So where do these flows come from? Well, when there are rain events in the lower basin, first of all, there is increased water in the lower Colorado and on the Gila, or depending on where the rain falls. But also, all those irrigators who are growing crops will cancel their water orders if it rains on their fields. And Reclamation has quite limited capacity to store the water once it's left Mead, and it takes 5 days to reach it down to travel down to southern Arizona and southern California. So if the water order is canceled in those intervening days, we end up with flows in the delta, and those have been very important to sustaining the delta's viability on that main stem corridor. So that's some of what's been keeping the delta alive as well. So what water is in the delta includes these flows at Morelos, also wasteways which come in at the end of the irrigation systems in both the Mexicali and Yuma valleys, which essentially behave at a much smaller scale, behave like the spills at Morelos. There's also seepage at the Morelos gates. There's also groundwater, and then there's agricultural return flows. And this is basically the sum total of fresh water that reaches the area. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the surface flow needs, and I can really only talk about surface flow because groundwater in the area, and actually even the agricultural returns, are largely unquantified. And so while we know that they are necessary and we are concerned about them, it's hard to talk about them in a quantified sense. So Carl gave you this. I'll go through it quickly again. A slight different number for base flow, 50,000 acre feet. There are some different numbers in literature. The truth is, to really know what we need, we'd have to start running some water through there and see how the ecosystem responds. Periodic overbank flows of about 260,000 acre feet, peaking at about 7,000 cubic feet per second once every 4 years on average. That's obviously a sort of rough figures, but it needs to happen on a regular basis to keep regenerating, allowing those cottonwoods and willows to germinate. And then finally, there is also a quantified water delivery that goes to the Cienega de Santa Clara, quantified, not dedicated. That's approximately 100,000 acre feet a year, a little bit more than that. And someone referred to it earlier. It's the drainage that's coming out of the Mountain Mohawk Irrigation and Drainage District, and it's crossing the border into Mexico. It is not being returned to the Colorado River, and instead is landing in this former mudflat. It was delta. It became a mudflat as we developed the river, and now as this brackish agricultural waste flow has been dumped there, has revived this tremendous wetland. So add it all up, and you annualize. You have to realize that what I'm doing here is taking this number and dividing it by 4 to annualize it, and you get an annualized demand of 215,000 acre feet a year, which I will say is 2% of the annual average flow of the river. So we've heard today that the water on the Colorado River is fully tapped, and we've also heard that storage is 4 times the annual average yield of the river's water production. So, could we really wring any more water from this system? And how are we going to accommodate these new demands? Now, we've also heard that the Rocky Mountain West and the Southwest in particular is experiencing blistering growth. I don't think there's a week that goes by that there's not a story in the paper about how this is the fastest growing region of the country. How are we going to satisfy these water demands and realize that it is in the context of new consumptive use water demands that we are trying to look for a way to secure water rights for the Colorado River Delta, and you realize that we've got a pretty steep challenge in front of us. Find my way here. So that being said, I look at the future of the Colorado River and I see some problems. While the lower basin states are already using their full allocation, as we've heard, the upper basin, as you heard from the Upper Colorado River Commission today, fully intends to build out its complete compact allocation. And you can see, in fact, the trend in the past few decades is that upper basin water use is on the rise. And I'm going to show you what that, in fact, could mean for the Colorado River Delta. In order to think about it, you have to realize that as the upper basin develops, there will be sending less water into Powell. That means less water goes into Meade. And right now, the only time you got a flood out of Meade, or the only time you got a flood in the Delta of a large scale, of a truly large overbank flooding scale, is when you get a flood out of Meade. So this is a bit of analysis that was prepared by Reclamation in their, I think it was actually for the surplus. We were negotiating surplus criteria, of course, during the drought. But this was done during that decision-making process. And you don't have to worry so much about the different alternatives here. That's not the point. The point is to look. And you also, the reason this starts low is that, of course, we had low reservoir elevations at the beginning of this analysis, and it jumps up because Reclamation in its wisdom always went back to their modeling that didn't necessarily anticipate the large drought that we had. But at any rate, going out into the future, when a lot of the noise kind of filters out, you see that in all of the alternatives they were considering, the probability of flows, flooding flows over 250,000 acre-feet below Morello Dam declines all the way down to well below 15%. And it's on that downward trajectory because what's driving that is the predictions about upper basin development. So we can't look at these flood events, flood releases out of Meade as something that will always be there. Clearly, they won't. Another trend that I see throughout the basin is the transfer of water from agriculture to urban areas. And once this occurs in any magnitude in the Yuma area or the Mexicali area, we're going to start losing some of those agricultural return flows to the Delta, be they as groundwater or actually as surface flows and surface drains. And again, that's not quantified, but we know that it's playing an important role in the Delta. The other thing that's on the rise is groundwater extraction, and it's probably going to happen with increasing frequency in the vicinity of the Delta. On both sides of the border, Reclamation is talking about, I think it's already done some, and it's talking about further increasing pumping volumes in the Yuma area. Mexicali relies heavily on pumping for irrigation, and I actually think they're going to respond to the groundwater losses from the lining of the AllAmerican Canal by sinking their wells deeper, which is only going to drop groundwater levels even further. So although, as I mentioned, groundwater is not quantified, we can tell something about sort of the trend of where it's going, and we think it's going down, and we think that those are going to begin to, or already have begun to impact the Delta and will further. Another trend that I see that I want to talk about, and I'll commend to you, is the second time his name has come up today, Matt Jenkins, a story that he just published a few weeks ago in High Country News about efficiency. And so what this trend towards improving efficiency in our operation of the Colorado River system. Now, I would be the first one to get up here and tell you that every drop of the Colorado River is precious, and we shouldn't be wasting any of it, but you have to think about what we're defining as waste. And so what I see right now is that as we are tightening the screws on an efficiently run system, where do you think that water is coming from? It's coming from the end of the system, which will no longer receive it. So it is coming at the expense of the Colorado River Delta. So a little bit about this one project. It's called the Drop 2 Storage Reservoir. It's named that way because it is located at the second drop of the AllAmerican Canal. And it is intended, it's called regulatory storage because it's intended to capture these non-storable flows that are created when the farmers at the Imperial Irrigation District cancel their water orders after it rains. So the project is not really going to have an impact during the big floods if we ever get them again out of Mead. But instead it's going to essentially store those smaller flows that I showed you in the graph of non-storable flows. Reclamation predicts that the project is going to capture, I don't know, their EA said 72,000 acre-feet a year. I saw a figure earlier today that said 77,000 acre-feet a year. What I can tell you is that we use those numbers to calculate what the loss meant for flows below Morello Dam into the Delta. During dry periods, it's an 87% reduction in surface flows passing below that dam for the Delta. So I see that as, again, a significant and basically unacceptable impact. This is just a calculation we did about what's going to happen to zero flow days, essentially looking at the years 2000 to 2004 with project and reclamation's projection of what would have happened without project and looking at their projection of what would have happened with project. With project, zero flow days go up to 97%. So this is really squeezing the last drops of water out of the river, particularly during dry periods, which is when the Delta needs that water to hang on. Yet another project on the horizon to increase water availability for consumptive use in the basin is the Humid desalting plant. As originally authorized and configured, the plant would eliminate flows that have supplied the Cienega to Santa Clara and replace them with a smaller volume of the plant's brine effluent at a much higher salinity, which is basically a recipe for certain demise at this wetland. A few years ago, I participated in a working group made up of federal officials, state representatives from Arizona, and a number of environmental groups. We actually came up with a really interesting set of consensus recommendations for how you might operate this plant and also other ways to replace bypass flows that don't require operation of the plant, but how you might operate the plant in ways that don't have harmful environmental consequences. But that being said, the federal government has not yet really adopted those recommendations. They are going ahead with a test of the plant, which I think has begun already. The official kickoff is in a couple of weeks, but I believe that the test has begun already. And we don't yet know what the federal commitment would be to protecting flows to the Cienega. So we basically can say that we don't know what the future will hold here. So let's revisit this list of water supplies to the Delta. Flows spilled at Morello and wasteways. Well, we know that those are going to diminish. Seepage at the gates, for now, I haven't heard anybody talking about fixing that, so I think we can rely on that. Groundwater, likely to drop. Agricultural returns, likely to diminish. The Delta is not going to survive if it has to continue with inadvertent and unintentional deliveries. I think that's clear. And to make the situation worse, overall supply of water in this river basin is likely going to decrease at the same time that our water demands are going to increase in a warmer world. We're going to hear a lot more about this tomorrow when Nicholas talks, and I'm really no expert in this area, but I wanted to throw up one other projection just to illustrate my point here, which was done by some scientists at NOAA and the University of Colorado, and they used the 2007 IPCC model simulations and correlated that somehow with the Palmer Drought Severity Index and projected. The center line here is this, mythical 15 million acre-foot annual yield of the Colorado River. This is the history, and this is their projection for essentially deficits from that average, but it's their projection for future flows off the Colorado River. So in that context, I think it's I feel very confident in saying that if we don't have a dedicated flow right for the Delta, we are not going to have a Delta anymore in the future. What we are going to have is a river of a mudflat and a lot of salt cedar. So, can we dedicate some water to the Delta? One of the first questions we have to ask is whether we can do this in the law, within the context of the law of the river. The compact establishes the relative importance of different uses of water. It names navigation and power generation as subservient to agricultural and domestic purposes. I think, as expected from a document of the 1920s, it does not address environmental flows. However, domestic is defined to include a broad array of uses, including household, stock, municipal, mining, milling, industrial, and other like purposes. In a colloquy during the compact negotiations, Mr. Caldwell of Utah suggested that there really ought to be a catch-all category to include a broader array of beneficial uses, to which Mr. Scrugum of Nevada replied, quote, "They might all be classified domestic purposes." I don't know if you can take colloquy. If you can debate over the compact, you can certainly debate over the colloquy. But at any rate, I would say that Article 4 of the compact does not purport to define all the beneficial uses of water. Both the Boulder Canyon Project Act and Arizona versus California list river regulation as a top priority use of Hoover Dam. The documents do not define river regulation, but I do know that Floyd Dominy testified before a congressional subcommittee in 1962 that Reclamation had used its river regulation authorization to release large flows below Morello's Dam to flush sediments from the Limmatroph reach of the river. The 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico remains completely silent, does not address flows for environmental purposes, and a treaty minute defining a binational agreement to pass flows below Morello's Dam has been suggested time and again by advocates for the Delta and by legal scholars who assure us that such a minute is admissible. Finally, I want to remind you again that a portion of the Delta, namely the Limmatroph Reach, is in the United States. So we do have the opportunity to think about how to create flows for the Delta outside of the treaty, which would avoid concerns about management of the river for extraterritorial purposes. And once water is in the Limmatroph, it basically has no choice but to travel unimpeded down into the upper Gulf. So once we can get it there, we're good. So, and we think about these things. Although there is no mechanism in place at present that could be used to create a delivery of water to the Delta, the law of the river really doesn't appear to present obstacles to such a delivery, although a big disclaimer, if someone were to prove someday that it would, then I would change my stance and say, okay, let's change the compact. The next question then is, how much would it cost? It's hard to answer that question because there really is not a robust market in Colorado River water, but one surrogate valuation of water is the profit that it generates in agricultural use. And I actually tried to look into this. I told you I was a pretend economist too. I tried to look into this a few years ago, and I found that there is actually a lot of water being used for relatively little profit. This graph shows net returns minus fixed costs on a dollar scale on this axis, and total volume of water. This is basically lower basin field crops. It's not all crops, and it's only lower basin. And what you can see is that there's about 1.5 million acre-feet of water being used to generate less than $20 an acre-foot return as profit, pure profit off the top, to the agricultural user. Now, that does not mean that you can go out and buy water for $20 an acre-foot, don't get me wrong, but it does suggest that perhaps the price tag shouldn't be quite so exorbitant. Bonnie Colby at the University of Arizona has recently done a much more sophisticated take on this study, and her results for southern Arizona, for Yuma, were quite similar to this. That being said, the cost of purchasing water, dedicated water for the Delta, really depends on what assumptions you make about which flows you have to purchase and then what price you'd have to pay. And so I'm not going to walk you through this whole chart, but I'll point out to you that I looked here at an annual lease at $60 an acre foot up to $250 an acre foot. $60 an acre foot is actually what we think might be a reasonable price to pay down in Yuma. $250, that's what California cities are paying the imperial irrigators for their water. Permanent right at $240 an acre foot is a number that we have sort of figured out might be a permanent right acquisition in Mexico, approximately. And then we basically bumped up those numbers for thinking about permanent rights in the United States. And then I went across and I looked at the whole shebang, the 215,000 annual average flow demand. That's purchasing water for the Cienega and the flood flows and the base flows. So you can see that we can get very quickly up to $500 million. And then obviously it just ranges below that from there. Finally, I want to talk about some real opportunities that we have to create a mechanism to allow dedicated flows to the delta. Because just because the law of the river doesn't create an obstacle doesn't mean that we have a way to do it. And that's in the current shortage policymaking process that Rick Gold mentioned this morning. Environmental Defense worked with a number of other NGOs to develop an alternative called Conservation Before Shortage, not Conservation Before Storage, which has been included by Reclamation as one of the 4 alternatives in their EIS that came out this week. And it was designed to create real benefits both for water users, because we knew it would never fly if it didn't appeal to water users in the basin, but at the same time to provide a mechanism to create these environmental flows in the delta for the environment. So it's largely based on the plan developed by the states with a few key differences. It extends the ability to create intentionally created surplus to third parties that don't hold contracts, including Mexico, as well as the federal government in the United States. And this could benefit the delta in a couple of ways, primarily by allowing parties to buy water, store it in Mead for the express purpose of then releasing it to create that flood flow that the delta needs. It also will increase the potential volume of banked water, which means that Mead levels are higher, which means we're that much closer to a natural or an uncontrolled flood on the system, which is, again, one way to get water down to the delta. A key piece of this proposal is opening up this mechanism of intentionally created surplus to Mexico. At this point in time, Mexico really has no way to store any of their Colorado River water. They have to take their treaty allocation every year and use it. There's no, think it's the alluvial floodplain. There's no canyon there where they could put a dam in and store it. So they're stuck using it every year. So this would provide some badly needed flexibility for Mexico and also would give them a way themselves to create those floods for the delta. The second major benefit for the delta and conservation before shortage is the creation of the mechanism to respond to declining surface water elevations in Mead with a federal offer to purchase the water from willing sellers rather than simply shorting them. And this has the benefit to water users of eliminating those involuntary shortages. Reclamation's draft recognizes this by stating that the state's proposal would result in the greatest loss in employment, income, and tax revenues, and it suggests that the probability of negative economic impact would be significantly smaller under conservation before shortage. And I can tell you that I've only read the executive summary, so I can't tell you what's in it in detail. It also projects that by 2026, under the state's proposal, there's a 35% chance of involuntary shortages, while there's only an 8% chance of involuntary shortages under the conservation before shortage proposal. Yet another benefit of this approach is eliminating the need to operate the Yuma desalting plant, because we thought that the way you would justify the federal expenditure of money to pay for all that forbearance would be replacement of that bypass flow. So the federal obligation is taken care of. You don't have to operate the plant. Finally, while we didn't explicitly put this in our recommendation, in our proposal, we did suggest to Reclamation that they should look at increasing the system set-aside that would have to go along with any created ICS. The states have suggested a 5%, essentially a donation to the system of any ICS created and stored in Mead. And we thought, well, what if you increase that and then create a sort of environmental water account? It might be a way. It's not a tax on every water user in the system, but it's a tax on these newest changes. So I think I'm about out of time, and I wanted to close with a quote from Aldo Leopold. He wrote in Sand County Almanac in an essay called The Green Lagoons, after paddling the Delta in 1922, that magic year. "It is part of the wisdom never to revisit a wilderness, for the more golden the lily, the more certain that someone has gilded it." On the map, the delta was bisected by the river, but in fact the river was nowhere and everywhere, for he could not decide which of 100 green lagoons offered the most pleasant and least speedy path to the Gulf. Well, sadly, I think Leopold's foresight was correct. I'm not under the illusion that we can create his 100 green lagoons, but I am optimistic that we can hang on to a few of them. And with that, I'll leave you with a picture of sunset over the delta, and I'm happy to take questions.